Hello and welcome to this episode of the Veterans History Project, Santa Clarita Valley Edition. The Veterans History Project is an initiative of the American Folklife Center at the Library of Congress. The Santa Clarita Valley Edition is spearheaded by College of the Canyons in association with Vets Back to the War Zone, the SCV Senior Center, and SCV TV. The project relies on volunteers to collect the oral histories of U.S. military veterans and support personnel who served in active war zones. Today is October 26, 2009. My name is Christine Bitter, and my guest today is Bill Kennedy, chairman of the SCV Chamber of Commerce and a veteran of the Vietnam War. Hi, Bill. Thank you for being here today.
Hi, Christine. It's a great pleasure to be here with you.
Well, let's start at the beginning and tell me the circumstances around your commission with the Air Force.
Sure. You can see I'm in uniform today. I retired as a colonel in 1992 from the Air Force. But I started my career actually in 1961 when, as a fresh graduate out of high school, I got an appointment to the United States Air Force Academy. Went there for 4 years and got my commission in 1965.
Okay.
And from there, I went to pilot training, got into jet fighters. Following that, and after my combat crew training and a little bit of upgrade and a couple of assignments, then I got shipped off to Vietnam as a captain.
Very exciting. So just out of high school, you kind of dropped into the military and started your career there. What made you decide to go into the military, to go to cadet school?
Well, you know, it was a multi-year thing, I think, that enticed me to go to the Air Force Academy. As a young child, I can remember my earliest recollection, in fact, is of airplanes. When I was 1 year old in my mother's arm, I pointed to an airplane in the sky and talked to her about it. And then I remember I had an older brother who went off to World War II, to the Navy. At age 18, he was 17 years my senior. And so I was 1 year old, saw him off at the airport, and I remembered that, seeing an airplane with lights flashing on it, and just intrigued me. From that point on, throughout my childhood, I was intrigued by flight. I'd draw pictures of airplanes, I'd build model airplanes. I was into it. I also got into rocketry as a young teenager. And my favorite courses in school were the sciences, physics, chemistry, mathematics, and whatnot. And it turns out that the Air Force Academy was just ideally made for me because their curriculum is heavily steeped in the sciences, and they prepare people for a military career, principle of which for the Air Force is flying. So I saw that as an opportunity for me to bring all of my likes together in one place. So when I got to high school, I started to aim for the Air Force Academy. There was a gentleman 1 year ahead of me. His name was Ed White, or rather his brother was Ed White, the astronaut who got killed on the launch pad at Cape Canaveral at the time it was called, before it was called Cape Kennedy. And he went to the Air Force Academy ahead of me, and then he brought back good stories about it. And so that prepared me, and so I put my application in and was fortunate enough to get accepted into it.
Okay. Tell me about your curriculum at the cadet school.
Sure.
And your training, too, if you received.
Yeah. Okay. It is a full college curriculum, basically, that ends up with a baccalaureate degree, but it's heavily steeped in sciences. So you have your basic core courses, and then you take a lot of courses in aerodynamics, physics, even astrophysics. We took chemistry, electrical engineering, mechanical engineering, and the like, which were courses that I really enjoyed. But we also had our, what I call the soft courses, the humanities and whatnot, that we had to get the basic requirements in. In point of fact, the training is rather intense, because mixed in with that academic curriculum, which, by the way, in 4 years I earned 144 semester hours credit, which probably would have been enough to qualify me at most universities for a master's degree at the time. But anyway, intertwined with that is lots of military training. So that during the summer, for example, we were committed to 2 months summer training somewhere in the world, usually at a military base or an installation. We also had military training throughout the week. Every Saturday, for example, we would have inspections and military training sessions, or we'd have a parade on the parade grounds, and in ranks training and marching training, for example, or gunnery training, to go out to the gunnery range and shoot, or survival training, go out to the jungle, or not the jungles in this case, but the mountains in Colorado, because the academy is located in Colorado Springs. We go up into the mountain area there and have to survive for a week with our skills in survival training. So those are the sorts of training programs we went through, very intense academically and physically. Also, all cadets were required to participate in some athletics. If you weren't good enough to participate at the college level on a team, you had to participate in intramurals. So at every season, we played sports of one type or another. There was no getting around it. You were required to.
Sounds like an amazing education.
Yeah, it was an amazing education. I can tell you this. It was very demanding, though. It was funny. The joke amongst the cadets at the time was that we were getting a $50,000 education, but it was jammed down our throat a quarter at a time.
Excellent. You earned it. When did you find yourself behind the cockpit, in the cockpit of a plane? What was the process to get there? Tell me about your first flight.
Okay. The process was quite simple. The senior year at the academy it's called first class year, you go through flight physicals. And those that are qualified then are geared and aimed towards a flying position upon graduation. So within 2 months after my graduation, I reported to Laotian Air Force Base in Del Rio, Texas, which we called Undergraduate Pilot Training Base, UPT. There, interestingly enough, my very first flight in training was actually in a Cessna aircraft. It was called the T-41 by military parlance, a trainer, Model 41, but it was actually a Cessna 172. Okay. That had been modified slightly for military training. And that was the introduction to flight, if you will, and they used that as a screening process to find out if the candidates who were there vying for their wings in the Air Force really were suited to flying. So it was very basic flying, and we did that for the first 30 hours. Those 30 hours we acquired, 30 hours of flying time. There were also 30-some hours of ground training time, but we acquired that in about 6 weeks' time. Okay. But after that first 30 missions, then we moved into jets. And the first jet was a T-37. That was a subsonic jet trainer. We got 120 hours in that of flying. And then for those that successfully completed that phase, we moved up to the supersonic jet trainer, which was a T-38 Northrop Talon, by the way. We used to call it the White Rocket.
Okay.
It's dual-engine jet aircraft that will go about 1,000 miles an hour.
So they would gradually get more quick.
Exactly. Much more faster and much more maneuverable. Now, interestingly enough to note, I finished my pilot training course in 1966, in June of 1966, and the last airplane I flew in pilot training was that T-38 Northrop Talon. It is still flying today as the supersonic jet trainer for Air Force pilots who are seeking their wings.
Tell me about how your first assignment came about. What were the circumstances around that? Mm-hmm.
Well, when we were finishing pilot training, obviously the thing was that you were aiming yourself towards some certain cockpit. In my case, I really wanted to fly a fighter. And they made it pretty clear from the outset, if you wanted to fly a fighter, you better be in the top 6 to 10% of the graduating class, because that's all the number of cockpits we expect to get.
That
I did. I was fortunate enough to make that. So I chose an F-4.
Okay.
Why the F-4? It was a brand new fighter at the time. It was also what we call a multi-role fighter. They could fly air-to-air missions, which is go out and shoot down other airplanes. You could fly air-to-ground, drop bombs against ground targets, for example. And on the air-to-ground mission, it was suited to fly all the types of air-to-ground missions that we did, which was basically close air support and interdiction or enemy defense suppression. So that's another thing that appealed to me about the F-4. It had all these capabilities, and I wanted to get into that cockpit. Mm-hmm. So upon graduation from pilot training, I was fortunate enough to be in the group that qualified for fighters, so I signed up for the F-4. My first assignment after that was off to George Air Force Base down near Hesperia here in California. So I left Texas, came out to California, and we had what is known as Combat Crew Upgrade, which was a 6-month training program to fly the F-4. Also had a 2-month training program in Tucson, Arizona for radar training, to understand how to operate the radar of the aircraft and the other weapon systems associated that were controlled through the radar of the airplane. From there, while we were going through that upgrade combat crew training, they were asking who wanted to go to Vietnam. They were looking for volunteers because then the war was raging pretty fully. I was one of the volunteers that stepped forward. In fact, just all my classmates from the Air Force Academy did so.
Looking for action.
We wanted the action, that's right. We felt that if we were going to be in uniform, if we were going to be true warriors, we couldn't sit on the sidelines. Mm-hmm. right, while the war was going on. And so we were standing in line to go. And they had us in what was called then a pipeline status, which was as soon as you finish your combat crew training, you'll go to Vietnam. So that's where I thought I'd go after all that training. But when I finished all my upgrade combat crew training, they said the line was so long waiting for Vietnam that they were going to send us to some holding bases in the U.S. In my case, I was sent to Goldsboro, North Carolina, to Seymour Johnson Air Force Base, to the 4th TAC Fighter Wing. And the expectation was that we would be there approximately 1 year and then get back into our pipeline status and get sent to Vietnam, the war. But what happened was in 1968, February of 1968, yes it was, the North Koreans took the USS Pueblo. And one of the commitments that we had at Seymour Johnson in the 4th TAC Fighter Wing was we were what was known as an Alpha designated wing, which is the first wing to go anywhere in the world on short notice if needed.
Okay.
And so we were required to keep bags packed at all times so that within 24 hours we could pick them up and go wherever we were directed. In this case, in February of 1968, they directed us to pick up and move to Korea.
Okay.
So we went to Kunsan Air Base in Korea on 24 hours notice, not knowing if we were going there for a few days or 6 months. Turned out to be 6 months.
Okay.
And then they brought us back for about a year and then sent us back for another 6 months. So that delayed my entry into Vietnam.
Okay.
Because while we had that commitment, we were flying combat support missions, for example, in Korea. And so they considered that a top priority as well. But I have to tell you, in all candor, that assignment there to Korea really helped me when I finally got to Vietnam, because we had excellent training during the time that I spent in Korea. We flew very realistic combat sorties every day. We even had some sorties where the North Koreans were shooting at us. We had some sorties where we shot back in accordance with the rules of engagement. And so that kind of gave me a little taste of what combat might be like before I was actually into it on a full-time basis. So, and with all the extra training and flying that I got, it helped me hone my skills in the F-4, so I was a much better pilot when I got to the war.
Well, I imagine that the Vietnam War was very intense in terms of needing to tap into your training. That practice you got was very beneficial. Tell me how it was. Tell me about your missions in Vietnam, your locations there. Go through that. And.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you first, you mentioned practice. You're right, practice was glorified kind of when we did practice because we weren't shooting real bullets. So we'd go out and practice against each other on air-to-air, for example, and we'd shoot the other guy down, figuratively. And then we'd have arguments on the ground after we landed on who really won the battle, right, and what really happened. And so it was kind of a very forgiving environment, but obviously the combat environment was not so forgiving. And I got that point really drilled home to me before I ever even got into country in Vietnam. Because the order of the day was that we had a stop-off point on the way to Vietnam, which was the Philippines. We stopped off at Clark Air Base for a couple of weeks before they actually then moved us on into Vietnam. The purpose for the stopover at Clark was to go through jungle survival training, so that in the event that we got shot down in Vietnam, we'd know how to survive in the jungle and either get ourselves out of the situation we were in or wait for pickup to get rescued. But I'll never forget my final day, graduation day they called it at Jungle Survival Training School, when the commandant got up on the stage of the theater, and there were a couple of hundred of us in there, and the very next day we were getting on an airplane to go to Vietnam. And he drove the point home about the gravity of the mission on which we were about to embark by this opening statement. Today, 53 Americans died in Vietnam. Tomorrow morning, you'll get on an airplane and take a 90-minute flight to that country. You better hope that your training has been good so you're not standing next in line for me to talk about tomorrow. Wow. And that's when it hit that, wow, today 53 Americans died there, and tomorrow I'm going to be there. So that kind of got the anxiety level up.
Came face to face kind of with the prospect of the danger and death.
Exactly. Exactly. So then I went into country with the attitude, well, I better rely on my training, and I better keep myself at my peak in order to get through the mission. Now, when I landed in Vietnam, first point of landing was Cam Ranh Bay. It was a very secure base way down south near Saigon, and the only thing that bothered me on that first day was the intense heat and humidity.
Okay.
Even though I'd just come from the jungle of the Philippines, I still had not become acclimated to the hot, humid climate. But anyway, I went from there. After one night's rest, they took me to my destination, which was Phu Cat Air Base, the first base I was assigned to in Vietnam, and where I flew most of my sorties from. Towards the end of my career, I actually moved up to Da Nang, which is very near the demilitarized zone, and finished up. But the activity at Phu Cat was a little bit different than Da Nang because it was farther south. And we had to confront attacks on the base at night. The Vietnamese never attacked during the day, except on one occasion, which really took us by surprise. But their modus operandi was to attack at night when they had enough ammunition and troops to do so. The ammunition, for the most part, came from North Vietnam down through a very diverse trail network through Laos and then into South Vietnam and then moved southward. That diverse trail network, by the way, was called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And it wasn't just one trail. It was a network of hundreds of trails that were interlaced. And most of the time that I flew in Vietnam, my mission was to interdict, to fly interdiction missions along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, or that is to try to stop those supplies from coming south. When I was at Phu Cat, I flew about every other day. I ended up totally at the end of the year with 176 combat missions. But we flew every other day or so on average, so that's when we were really subjected to fire of varying degrees, from very, very light to very intense, depending on the mission and the area which we flew, the type of mission that we flew. We got attacked at night about every third or fourth night, as I recall.
Okay.
Very limited attacks. They would last literally for a period of 5, maybe 10 minutes, and then be over. But it would be 122 millimeter rockets coming in, 82 millimeter rockets, mortar fire, and things of that nature. Occasionally, ground forces, Vietnamese, trying to get through the barbed wire, the perimeter of our base. They called them sappers, and they'd be carrying satchel charges or knapsacks with explosives in them, and then they'd throw them into buildings and things, or hand grenades, and set them off. So for the most part, though, we lived as Air Force pilots a pretty comfortable life. For example, the base that I lived on there, both at Phu Cat and Da Nang, we had hard wall quarters. I had air conditioning, you know, to escape that heat and humidity.
Haven't heard about that much yet.
Yeah, and there was a reason for it at the time. And the Army and Marine forces who were in Vietnam will always claim that we pilots were pampered, and we were. There's no question about it. But somebody had made the decision along the way that in order to fly a high-speed jet fighter, you've got to really be focused on the task. And they did not want to do anything or have anything happen to us that would take away from that focus. Hence, they had strict rules. You had to have a certain amount of sleep before you could go fly, and or the opportunity for sleep at any rate. And they wanted to make your environment as comfortable as possible so that you would get a restful sleep, hence the air conditioning.
Okay.
So we got lucky there.
You were investments. You had an expensive weapon to fly and lots of money to go into your training. So
that's how they looked at it, exactly. Now, it's interesting to note, by the way, contrast the Phu Cat experience with Da Nang. Because Da Nang was so much closer to North Vietnam and they could get ammunition more quickly, the Viet Cong attacked us at Da Nang about every other night. So almost twice as often as we got attacked.
Tell me about your missions in Da Nang and what they entailed primarily.
Sure. A few of the missions went up north. We would bomb against bridges or targets of that nature, supply depots and dumps where they were amassing ammunition or other supplies that they were getting ready to ship to the south. We would escort sometimes reconnaissance aircraft, where we would fly up, and reconnaissance aircraft go in unarmed as kind of one of the laws of war, that the reconnaissance aircraft is not armed, they're just there to take pictures and bring that back. But if they got attacked, then we would fly overhead with them and then go down and try to attack the attackers or suppress some of the defenses that were coming up. Mostly the missions were right along the North Vietnamese and the Laotian border, where there were mountain passes that kind of funneled the supplies from the north down south. Places like Mugia Pass, for example, or Ban La Boy Pass. They had names such as those. And we would go in there and look for convoys of vehicles or other things that indicated that they were moving supplies south, and actually attacked the convoys, the trucks.
Well, there were people driving those convoys.
Correct.
And how did you, we were talking about acclimating to weather.
Mm-hmm.
How did you acclimate to causing casualties to the enemy?
Sure.
Was there a certain process that you went through before you went on these missions, or how did you deal with that?
Well, there's a conditioning process at play there too. Basically, I think a lot of us went over in an idealistic way, sense, before we ever got to the war, to have already divided the world up into good guys and bad guys, if you will.
Okay.
I can remember, for example, as a cadet at the Air Force Academy, I got there in June of 1961. In August of 1961, the Berlin Wall went up. And I can remember the impact that had around the world about what were the Soviets doing. They were dividing the city of Berlin, and they were actually putting a stone wall up in the city to divide the eastern part of the city from the western part of the city. And what it was intended to do was not to keep the West out, but it was intended to keep those that lived in the East in. They were suppressing their independence and their freedom. And I can remember that had a very sobering effect on me. In fact, I can remember reading in a newspaper at the time, I saw a cartoon, the title of which was, "Attention, you're now leaving the eastern sector." And this was a sign that was up all around Berlin in 4 languages of the 4 occupying powers. But it was to notify people they were leaving. But in the cartoon, it showed a West German soldier who was holding a lifeless body in his arms, and that body was the person that tried to come over the wall from the east, and they were shooting to kill at that time. And so that had an effect on me, that I knew that the world had bad people in it as well as good people, and I wanted to fight the bad people. More to the conditioning of when you actually get into war, now you have to have, in a very visceral level, make the decision, am I prepared to kill or not? It helps, quite frankly, if the enemy is dehumanized, you know, and sometimes they do that to themselves.
Okay.
I can remember, for example, at Phu Cat, a buddy of mine, another, in fact, an Air Force Academy classmate, Don Hansen was his name. We were walking down a flight line one mid-morning, and an Army helicopter landed, and an Army soldier got out, and he was carrying a small bundle of white that had blood on it. I looked at him and wondered what he was doing, and walked over, and it turned out the bundle he was carrying was a young girl. She was probably 6 years old, maybe, a Vietnamese girl, and she was missing both arms and both legs. And they had just been hacked off by the Viet Cong, who had gone into her village. Her father happened to be the village chieftain. And the Viet Cong had told her father that they wanted rice to support their troops. And he said, no, I don't support the Viet Cong. And that was their retribution.
Okay.
And when we saw things like that, that made it easy to put ourselves in the airplane the next day and say, we're going to go get them.
Well, tell me about a memorable mission. Tell me about a memorable mission. Tell me about maybe a story of courage.
Okay. I'll tell you one memorable mission was a mission where I bombed myself. Yeah.
And you're still here to tell
I'm still here to talk about it.
Excellent.
Yeah. Now that may sound like it's hard to do, but it's really not. And I'll tell you why. In an airplane, when you drop a bomb, it's just free falling. But of course, the airplane is still flying, and it's possible to fly your airplane into the bomb after you've dropped it. And I did that on one mission. It was about 30 miles north of Phu Cat. We were flying what's called close air support, which means some Army units were tied down and in battle, in a hot battle with the Viet Cong, and they needed help. So we went in with air support, and in order to do that, to help the Army, we always got as low as we possibly could to the ground to drop the bombs, so that we could be more accurate in our placement of the bombs and make sure that we avoided hitting the friendly forces. But in so doing, we also subjected ourselves to much more intense ground fire. And it was, quite frankly, ground fire that was the most devastating to us when we were flying fighters, because they could put up ground fire with such heavy intensity below 4,500 feet that sometimes it was difficult to get through it without getting hit. So I was flying the mission to support the ground troops, and just as I was coming into a ridge to let the bombs go, I was dropping napalm at the time. That's another favorite weapon that we drop close to our own friendly forces because it doesn't have high explosive power or lots of shrapnel coming off of it, but it puts down fire. And I was just lining up my sights, just getting to the pickle point, what we call the pickle point, which is the point at which we release the bombs. And I was taking some pretty heavy ground fire. And in order to avoid the ground fire, we used to do what's called jinking, move the airplane around, make it random and unpredictable. But when you got in close to somebody, I learned very early on, when a bullet is coming right at you, you can see it coming. Now, the good thing about being in an airplane is most of the fire originates pretty far away, half mile or a mile away, and so it doesn't get to you instantaneously. It takes a couple of seconds. So you have time to react if you can see it fast enough. And I saw this fusillade of fire coming up right at me. So just as I released the bomb, I pushed the airplane forward to duck under the bullets that were coming, and ran my airplane right into the bomb I had just dropped. It exploded, hit it with the left wing, it exploded, and wrapped around my left wing, and there were flames shooting about 60 feet behind me. Now, I didn't realize I'd hit my own bomb. All I thought was the fire had chopped up my left wing and hit the fuel tank. So I was on fire. So I yelled at my backseater, we may have to eject.
Did you go down in a ball of flames? Were you on the ground after that?
Well, at that point, I was about 800 feet off the ground.
Okay.
But I was going 600 miles an hour.
Okay.
So I pulled the nose up, and I did not want to bail out there if we had to bail out, because landing in a place that you've just bombed is apt to get you an unwelcome reception.
Absolutely.
So we had a rule in Vietnam, we call it the 2 ridgeline rule. If you got hit and you had to bail out of your airplane, try to direct it at least 2 ridgelines away from where you were working. Okay. The reason for that is the people on one ridgeline are apt to be able to see what you're doing. If you're bombing in a valley, for example, or on their ridge, they know that you're doing it. But if you get at least 2 ridgelines away, you're probably out of sight.
The visibility is...
What you were doing was out of sight of the people amongst whom you'd be landing, and maybe they might just be a little bit more friendly to you than the ones that just saw you dropping bombs on them. So anyway, I pulled the nose up and said, we're going to try for 2 ridge lines, and then we'll see what happens with this airplane. Well, I got up to 2 ridge lines, and the fire was still going, but the airplane was still flying. And all the cockpit instruments were indicating the systems were all working. So I said, all right, I'm just going to accelerate out of here. So I lit the afterburners, got my speed up real fast, and when I got up to high speed, it blew the fire out. So I went back to Phu Cat and landed. But that's when we realized, after I got on the ground and I could look underneath the wing, I could see the damage, and I could see the residue of napalm on my wing, and then I realized it was the bomb that I had bombed myself on that mission that caused the damage, and not really enemy fire, although it was enemy fire I was trying to avoid when it happened. So that was memorable from that perspective. Not too many people, I think, can make that claim that they bombed themselves in war.
Absolutely. Well, it sounds like you're playing the odds to get in and out of there, and it's good that you made it back safely.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Bill, for your time with us today and your wonderful stories, and your perspective and everything. We appreciate it.
Well, glad to be here today, Christine.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And thank you for watching. If you'd like to see more Santa Clarita episodes of the Veterans History Project, log on to scvtv.com. I'm Christine Bitter, and we'll see you next time.